My name is Aidan Thompson. I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives in the Jubilee Centre. This is the second webinar in a new series of events that we are running in 2021, and details of some of the forthcoming webinars will be shared later on this afternoon. We'll hear from 4 speakers about the practical delivery of teaching character through the arts at both primary and secondary level. If you have a question for any or all of our speakers, please do use the chat function and we'll ask as many of the questions as possible once all 4 speakers have spoken. Today's webinar focuses on the practical ways in which we can teach character through art subjects. We assume here today that we can teach character by using art to provide a stimulus to moral and ethical discussions, that works of art themselves hold an ethical value, and that one can engage in a discussion about that value in addition to discussing an artwork's aesthetics. This evening, we will hear from some of the best practices for how this is done in art lessons, in music, through poetry and stories. The arts are just one way that we can teach and develop character in education, but the arts are also the most popular and predominant way of doing so, particularly in schools and other educational institutions. There are many reasons for this, but perhaps most obviously it is because art is created to hold up a mirror to society, to provide popular and accessible presentations of feelings, emotions and virtues that encompass all of human life, to provide escape through fantasy and science fiction, and to parody the absurd. This is because the arts offer a more time-honoured source of insight into good and bad human character, its relationship to human flourishing and the development of the virtues. Of course, the opposite argument also exists, challenging, in an age of science, the potential of works of art to serve as credible sources of knowledge. There are, for instance, both ancient arguments for the view that poetry and other arts are more conducive to moral corruption than moral improvement, and modern claims that aesthetic purposes of the arts have little to do with moral value. Artists themselves do not always want to be seen as moral exemplars or moral educators in the same way that we treat our teachers. Let them work that one out, as John Lennon famously quipped after writing the gibberish song, I Am the Walrus. So frustrated was he that people wanted to interpret the meaning behind his lyrics. But does art just exist for pleasure and utilitarian purposes? Indeed, taking pleasure and only taking pleasure from a piece of art is perfectly reasonable in terms of consuming art, if it makes you happy, as Sheryl Crow sang. But is there an educational potential that is unique to the arts that can help us educate for the moral and even call us to moral action, help us to be more honest, more loving, more compassionate, more resilient and more determined? When you try and come for me, I keep on flourishing, sang Ariana Grande. We form our character over a lifetime, and the end goal of character development is to flourish, to be the most excellent person that one can possibly be, contributing positively and meaningfully to society. Character is developed by education, by emulation and by experience. Art often provides us with the opportunity to discuss all 3 of these. Can imaginative art be said to have any moral or significant purpose? In what sense might different art forms contribute to this moral knowledge? And how might the arts be taught in a morally educational way? These are just some of the questions that you might have in mind as our panelists speak today. Are the subjects of works of art heroes? And can we aspire to ever emulate them? As educators, we can use such exemplars to inspire our students to aspire, so that our students can aspire to be the best they can possibly be. We can be heroes in how we use art, all art, as we educate for character, even if it's just for one day. Our first speaker is Rebecca Teague, Head of School at the University of Birmingham School, and the Jubilee Centre's first and currently only Ambassador of Character Education. Beck is Director of Character at the University School and has led how and where character is taught and caught across the curriculum, and will be speaking today about the place of character in art and music. Over to you, Beck.
Thank you very much, Aidan, and thank you so much for having me. And I really look forward as well to learning from everybody else who has their own stories to share today. Let's just get this started. So a little context first about our school. We were opened in 2015 by the University of Birmingham, essentially as a school for Birmingham. As a super diverse city, we take a nodal entry of admissions to ensure that we take from the 4 communities across Birmingham City. We're fully inclusive with, I think, 42 pupils currently with an EHCP, a statement of special needs. But the most important thing for today, I think, is that we were designed with character education at the heart of all we do. Through the design of the curriculum, through our recruitment processes, through policy, we ensure that character education is absolutely pervasive. We've used the Jubilee Centre model of character being a taught, caught and sought development, and have a bespoke curriculum that runs through form time and through separate discrete lessons. But as a new school, we also had a unique opportunity to look at how we can authentically and deliberately develop character through subjects. We wanted a narrative that ran through curriculum where children were learning not just art, music, maths and physics, but really to become musicians, to become artists, to think about their journey not being through Key Stage 3 or 4, but a journey through their lifetime. And so we posed some very big questions to our curriculum leaders. What are the key virtues that pupils need in a subject in order to flourish? What opportunities need to be built into a subject for this to happen so that planning for character is genuinely deliberate? What leadership is needed both in department and across the school for that to manifest itself? And how can we ensure opportunities for character development are inclusive and democratised? I don't think it's any surprise that PE jumped in first with a very brilliant scheme of work, but art and music and English were a very, very close second, with really inspirational journeys mapped out. I know my colleagues are going to talk a little bit more about literature and poetry, so I thought I'd focus on music and then finish with a little slide about what we do with art. I think the premise for using the art subjects so much is that virtue itself is practical. So there's little point in knowing theoretically what is virtuous if it's not practiced. We need to provide spaces where virtue is practiced, errors are made, mistakes reflected upon, and the cycle continue. So there are very easy parallels to draw with music as a practical subject. Children, to become musicians, need to play an instrument, need to practice, need to make mistakes, and there are many, and reflect on these and start again. So how we designed the curriculum in Key Stage 3 is that all of our pupils are indeed musicians. If we look here, we can see our very first Year 7s learning to play brass. All of our pupils in Year 7 learn to play the trumpet, or the violin, and guitar. They are shown mastery by their teacher, who is very much part of their lesson alongside them, learning with them. Pupils who already have a little expertise become mentors in the classroom, sharing their practice and role modelling what excellent musicianship looks like. All lessons start with a reminder of how we use empathy in terms of giving feedback, in showing understanding for those who are at different stages of their learning journey, and everyone is taught to give feedback with empathy and compassion. Every lesson ends with a period of reflection, using courage and honesty to critique performance. Music are very clear about having a growth mindset of music being not there yet, showing mastery as a process of development based on self-discipline and determination, something we can all do. Teachers, for example, in the 3rd year or 4th year of school being open, had to set themselves a challenge, and 6 staff chose to learn a musical instrument and then played in assembly in front of the children. In terms of the core curriculum, we try and put music absolutely wherever we can. And it's not unusual to have pop-up orchestras appearing in the lunch hall, in the front foyer, outside if it's a nice day, where children can share what they've learnt, share their passion, share their joy, share their awe. In terms of audiences, we also teach good audience etiquette so that everyone knows how to show kindness and compassion and respect whilst they are listening to their friends. They're taught how to clap and how to look appreciative. We have a huge SORT curriculum as well in our enrichment programme, where children are given the opportunity to explore something they're passionate about. We have all sorts of different ways of accessing this through ensembles before school, lunchtime, after school, and in the discrete enrichment programme. And we have at any one point 200 children learning music through their peri lessons, which are funded by the school. We celebrate the civic role that music can have by taking our choir to old people's homes, by raising money in the community with our jazz bands, and just by generally sharing music in the community wherever we can. We make sure that role models come into school to share their music with our children, and that these reflect the children's communities. We will say yes to anyone who wants to come in and play. So we've had, I think on the bottom left here, a New Orleans jazz band literally camping in the car park whilst they were on a world tour, playing with our pupils. We have a local gospel choir, and we have the Chineke Black Ensemble who did a pop-up string quintet at lunchtime. We want our children to seek pleasure in music. We want them to understand it's for them, that it's part of who they are. Whether the impact on their character is possible to assess or measure is really hard. But if you walk into any music lesson, you will see children who are listening silently, playing with focus and determination, who are happy, who are respectful, who collaborate beautifully, and who seem genuinely to be filled with joy and awe. This manifests itself in the huge take-up of music at GCSE, where we have over 60 children currently studying in a subject that is on the decline, if not already disappeared from most GCSE curriculum. Leadership of music takes courage. It's not easy to have your office next to the steel pan practice room, but we understand it's not a sacrifice, but what we need to do for music to happen. It's also fairly expensive to buy everyone an instrument, but that's the price we pay for celebrating it. And as a leadership team, we also take part, coming to concerts, showing our support, and playing wherever we can. A similar story takes place elsewhere within the art department, who are gradually overtaking the whole school with their galleries of pupils' work. When the school was built, and we have the most beautiful building, walls were completely bare because the architects didn't want anyone else's work to be there. They wanted the work to celebrate our own community. You can see a few pictures of corridors here. I think there's some protest art happening there, and there's some lovely photography exhibition on the wall there too. So arts and the teaching of character is absolutely crucial. This is nothing to do with art, but I think it epitomises this beautiful saying from Jason Reynolds' poetry very well, that the truth is the treasure I've discovered under the heavy stones. Learning an instrument, I think, sometimes feels like lifting a heavy stone, but the beauty that our children get from feeling accomplished, from being able to have the opportunity to play both individually and together, is tangible in our school. And so the arts, we find, is an excellent way of teaching character. Thank you.
Thanks, Beck. Moving on to our second speaker today, Dr. Karen Bolin is head of the Montrose School in Massachusetts, USA. Dr. Bolin is an experienced character education leader and practitioner, as well as being a published scholar. She is also a senior scholar at Boston University's Centre for Character and Social Responsibility. Author of books including Building Character in Schools and Teaching Character Education Through Literature, Karen has a huge amount of experience of both research and practice of delivering character education through the arts. Over to you, Karen.
Thank you, Aidan, and thank you, Beck. That was really beautiful. I would like very much to begin this session on poetry, why poetry matters, with a poem. And this poem is dedicated to all of you who are not just essential workers as educators in a pandemic. We've just celebrated our 1-year anniversary of going into quarantine, and many of you have been back in action on the front lines in school every day, and it's been quite an unprecedented experience in terms of generosity, dedication, and agility. So this poem is for each one of you. It's called "For One Who Is Exhausted" by John O'Donohue. When the rhythm of the heart becomes hectic, time takes on the strain until it breaks. Then all the unattended stress falls in on the mind like an endless increasing weight. The light in the mind becomes dim. Things you could take in your stride before now become laborsome events of the will. Weariness invades your spirit. Gravity begins falling inside you, dragging down every bone. The tide you never valued has gone out, and you are marooned on unsure ground. Something within you is closed down, and you cannot push yourself back to life. You have been forced to enter empty time. The desire that drove you has relinquished. There's nothing else to do now but rest and patiently learn to receive the self you have forsaken in the race of days. At first, your thinking will darken and sadness take over like listless weather. The flow of unwept tears will frighten you. You've traveled too fast over false ground. Now your soul has come to take you back. Take refuge in your senses. Open up to all the small miracles you rushed through. Become inclined to watch the way of rain when it falls slow and free. Imitate the habit of twilight, taking time to open the well of color that fostered the brightness of the day. Draw alongside the silence of stone until its calmness can claim you. Be excessively gentle with yourself. Stay clear of those vexed in spirit. Learn to linger around someone of ease who feels as though they have all the time in the world. Gradually, you will return to yourself, having learned a new respect for your heart and the joy that dwells far within slow time. And I love this poem for so many reasons, but it just captures so powerfully where many of us are at not only at this moment in time, but at different moments in time, having taken care of family members who are ill or who we've lost. There's so many beautiful images. I shared this with my faculty just last week, and people responded on many different levels. So why does poetry speak to us, and why does it matter? I like to begin when teaching with poems that are eminently accessible, because so many of us from childhood, personal experience, exam-driven classes have had encounters with poetry that might be unsatisfying, tepid, too analytical, and not an experience of what it's meant to be. What is poetry uniquely qualified to do? Why is it so important to the education of character and virtue? Because poetry speaks to us as human beings. It speaks first and foremost to the human heart. It awakens our emotion, our sense of humanity, and it also deeply connects us with the natural world around us and engages all of our senses. And so this brief segment this morning is really just a teaser for what could be a fuller presentation on a framework for teaching poetry that harnesses its unique powers to jumpstart the heart to engage memory, imagination, and what I call the desire to lead a virtuous life. So if you could take one thing, no matter what age you teach, from preschool to university students, you can take this one short poem and bring it to a discussion with your students, pupils, colleagues. And I selected this poem by Carl Sandburg, not only because it's short, and this is a short segment, but also because it speaks so powerfully to all of the challenges we've been facing, particularly here in the United States, in our highly polarized political culture. And this poem is one that speaks to us with a very simple set of metaphors. The single clenched fist, lifted and ready, or the open asking hand held out and waiting. Choose, for we meet by one or the other. And what we do with our students who are aged 11, 12 years old is begin the school year with this poem and read it aloud 2 to 3 times. The single clenched fist, lifted and ready, or the open asking hand held out and waiting. Choose, for we meet by one or the other. And the students, lift their single clenched fist, and there's a whole discussion of what is that fist ready for? A fight, or is it self-defense? Is it ready to show protest? Or the open asking hand held out and waiting for help, waiting for a handshake, waiting to be lifted up. The exploration is ongoing, but we have this pivotal short line: choose. And we're reminded of the freedom to choose our attitude before we meet anyone, for we meet by one or the other. Students take images of the hand and make commitments of how they will choose to meet each other, how they'll choose to meet new students at the beginning of the school year, how they'll choose to meet them in the cafeteria or on a team. And they write very specific commitments to greet people with a smile, with eye contact, with a welcoming greeting, and that they're challenged to get more and more specific. And the poem remains on the bulletin board for the remainder of the year as a reminder of their power to choose their attitude. So poetry, unlike an essay, a moral argument, a philosophical treatise, reaches us in a very succinct, concise way, because it has this power of condensation, and it stays with us. Dana Gioia, who is one of the poet laureates in the United States and has a phenomenal essay, Poetry as Enchantment. I encourage you to read it. So wonderful. It says, the poetry summons powerful images and awakens deep emotions. William Wordsworth, it's the spontaneous overflow of emotion recollected in tranquility. And Percy Bysshe Shelley, the great instrument of moral good is the imagination, and poetry administers to the effect by acting upon the cause. So choosing poetry that sparks the kinds of conversation about what matters most to friendship, to community, to citizenship, to study, to family, is such a rich and inspiring tool to have conversation about character. So aside from being uniquely qualified to jumpstart the heart, to make you feel right away, and then have a discussion about why do I feel this way, that's where the real ethical reflection on literature can begin. But the poetry works its effect first by moving us. And I always say to teachers, you never want to start a unit on poetry with the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner or some long, complex poem. We need to hook the interest and imagination first with simpler pieces. But when we do that, we can get young people to very profound and deep understandings of complex poems, like one of my favorite, Keats' Ode on a Grecian Urn. Here we have 2 students came to the whiteboard. Neither one of them were strong literature students in a particular way. They were interested, open, just by their peers reading aloud of stanzas, they were able to illustrate these 2 powerful scenes. The piper eternally piping in springtime, the 2 lovers just about to kiss. We have 2 different renderings of that here. And then the mysterious funeral procession, emptying out a mysterious mountaintop town, making their way with the the priest and his sacrifice for a service. Very complex poem, but the power of the language, the power of the verse to inspire art is extraordinary. We know that poetry enchants and communicates themes that matter. It arrests our attention. What we've also come to know is that it works in a different neural pathway than prose. In fact, if a family friend of ours is suffering from dementia, and she's been speaking less and less, now she doesn't speak at all, but if you put a poem in front of her, she will read it with intonation and spirit. And so it's like music, it affects us in a very different way. So its potential is enormous. It evokes catharsis. It awakens an opportunity to have discussions in the classroom unlike I've ever seen before. At our school, the Montrose School in Medfield, Massachusetts, which is deeply committed to character, but we just as an English department have been looking at the power of poetry over the last 5 years. And now the students lead school-wide poetry jams. It was a great way for students to come together during the quarantine. They've been publishing books of poetry. They've entered into national competitions, and they are teaching, the older students are teaching the younger students the powers of poetry. So I look forward to talking more about how we can teach poetry effectively in the Q&A in order to evoke what I call the sort of new understanding and insight. It really does engender the kind of empathy, questioning, and reflection so critical to practical wisdom. And I just want to close with this consideration. Poetry is not a magic bullet, but it is a helpful teacher. And the effective teaching of poetry educates and trains the heart, our powers of perception. And in a time when we're so disconnected from one another, the study of poetry invites us to reconnect, to pay attention to what matters most, to be able to reflect on competing claims about what's good and what it means to respond well or to respond poorly in the face of life's challenges. It allows us to perceive emotion and to express emotion in all the varied crossroads of life. It serves as a very useful guide to us. And I want to excerpt from the poem Sometimes by Mary Oliver. She says, instructions for living a life. Pay attention, be astonished, and tell about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. It feels like we're rushing straight through to move on to our next speaker, and that we need to sit and reflect after each of the first 2 presentations, but we will do that when we move to the discussion shortly. Moving on to our 3rd speaker. Paul Watts is lecturer on the Jubilee Centre's MA in Character Education. Paul is also a former research fellow in the centre and a primary school teacher and a fellow PhD student. And I'm going to hand over to Paul to talk about using stories to teach character. Paul.
Thanks, Aidan. So it's important to say at the outset that I'm coming at this from a primary school perspective, but there's significant overlap, and some of the core principles will be shared with secondary education as well. And as teachers, we know that stories are exciting resources that we can use to engage pupils, and that we can use as the basis of lesson planning or of whole topics, because it helps to contextualize learning and it stimulates children's interests. But quite clearly, stories can also be used to teach about character. And for some teachers, this will be a conscious and intentional effort. And for others, it may be enacted in some form or other, but it may not necessarily be realised. And what I'm hoping to understand through my PhD research is how teachers value and use stories as that vehicle for character education, but also how and why they select these stories for that purpose, as well as whether they do that intentionally or whether teaching about character occurs incidentally when using stories for other reasons. And admittedly, when I was teaching in Upper Key Stage 2, prior to joining the centre, I'd use stories in lessons and I'd highlight pertinent points about character, but I didn't intentionally select stories for that purpose, and teaching about character wasn't a core focus of mine at the time. Yet I noticed that within the early years foundation stage and within Key Stage 1, teaching about virtues like honesty, friendship, courage and kindness, just to name a few, was much more explicit. And there are an abundance of short stories and picture books that focus on these. And it was this observation and reflection on my own practice which sparked my interest in some of the Jubilee Centre materials. And I sought to use these at the time to make my teaching about character much more intentional. So what is it about stories that makes them useful for character education, and how can we use them? Well, some stories will naturally lend themselves to teaching about character. As I say, there are lots of short stories and picture books that are available that either have a moral message at the heart of them or aim to teach about a particular aspect of good character. And within these, children can learn about character successes. They can also learn from their failures, and they can reflect on how they might act if they were to face similar circumstances in their own lives. And of course, there are also longer and more complex stories. And these often provide a social commentary and a unique insight into characters' lives and situations. Children can interact with characters and their situations and gain access to contexts that they may not ever experience in real life, including those from different cultures or times in history. And I suppose in this way, stories can broaden children's understanding beyond lived experiences. And added to this, and often with longer or more complex stories, children are able to compassionately engage with characters, and they're able to adopt others' perspectives. They're able to see within a story what the characters are thinking and feeling. They're able to see characters' motivations, and often their reasoning as to why they choose or act in certain ways. And this is something that we don't often get to see in real life. And this is why stories are excellent ways of providing this insight. So, as I mentioned before, I'm hoping to understand why teachers value stories and why certain stories are selected. For example, whether there are certain features or characteristics that are looked for. I also want to know how stories are used. We have recommendations about how to teach character education using stories. I want to know whether teachers generally do this in practice, and what else we can learn from teachers as the experts in the field. And what we've got to bear in mind is that reading and listening to stories where there are lessons to be learned about character isn't necessarily enough to teach about it. So for example, historically, there was this view that a good moral story speaks for itself. And at times, adults were even advised not to explain the moral message through fear of ruining the story's effect. Now, I can appreciate this, and I can understand the concern about overanalyzing a story. And of course, for some children, the message of the story will be understood. But what's clear from research is that not all children will understand a simple moral message of a story. They won't understand it in the same way, nor necessarily in the same way that an adult will understand it, or even as the author intended originally. And in longer or more complex stories, children might not pick up on the qualities of character that help the protagonists to navigate these complex moral situations, or even the weaknesses of character that might lead the character to further problems. So we have to consider what we can do to support this learning. And it's the facilitation of the teacher, parent, or even the peer that can be highly influential in helping. So prompts encouraging children to explain key story events can aid their comprehension, and it can help children to identify moral lessons. Discussions and follow-up activities can help children to pick up on morally salient features within stories and situations, and to understand others' perspectives, and to reason about what they would consider to be the right course of action when a character faces a moral quandary. Then there's reflection, which is extremely important, and I know that Catherine's going to discuss this shortly too. So children need to be given the opportunity, space and encouragement to reflect on the meaning of the story, and also to relate this to their own lives. We can't take for granted that children will automatically apply what they've learned from a story context into their own life. And in fact, some of the research studies suggest that children have more difficulty comprehending and relating that message or the learning point when the story involves anthropomorphized characters or is based within a fantasy setting, as a lot of stories are. Now, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't use stories with those features. It just highlights the importance of teachers and parents as the facilitators who can help children to reflect and to relate that message or learning point. And just to end, just to say that we can guide children to reflect on how those story events are applicable to them, and when, where, and in what ways they could be relevant, as opposed to just assuming that these connections are automatically being made by the children. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Our fourth speaker this afternoon is Catherine O'Leary. Catherine is a research fellow in the Jubilee Centre, joining the centre in September 2020. Before that, Catherine accrued 6 years teaching experience in the primary sector, where she was a member of the senior leadership team and held roles such as English lead and art lead. Hand over to Catherine to talk about some of the resources that the Jubilee Centre has produced in the area of character in the arts, but also in particular art in character in the arts at primary level. Catherine.
Thank you very much, Aidan. So as Aidan mentioned, I trained as a primary school teacher and worked in the primary education sector, where I led English as subject coordinator. And there was a real emphasis on reading, engaging all pupils in a variety of different texts. And there is such exciting potential within both primary and secondary English curriculums to use the power of the written word through carefully selected stories to enable us to teach pupils about character, about virtues, what it means to be human, and also about themselves. And using a story to help to guide a discussion or to help begin a conversation about the type of person that a student would like to become is a really powerful and creative approach to take. And so on the Jubilee Centre's website, within the teacher resources section, you can find a scheme of work that's called Read, Grow, Go. And this is a programme of study that's been developed for pupils in Key Stage 1. So it's aimed at 5 to 7-year-olds. It's a series of 8 individual lessons, each of which uses a different story to teach about a particular character virtue. So there are 2 lessons for each of the 4 types of virtue. So the moral, performance, intellectual and civic. And the specific virtues which the lessons cover range from compassion and honesty to curiosity and teamwork. So the aim of the set of lessons was for the focus to be wide-ranging and to introduce pupils to different elements of character. And it was really important that the texts chosen were relevant in promoting those particular character virtues. So linking back to what Paul said about intentionally selecting a story to teach about character. But they also needed to be engaging and accessible for young children, with the potential as well to open up a dialogue with them about the content of the plot or the sometimes difficult and challenging situations which the various characters might find themselves in. So each lesson follows a structured approach, which begins with the teacher reading the class one of the 8 stories. And as the story is shared with the pupils, they are challenged to work out what the message of the narrative might be, and to try and identify what the character virtue in focus is. So the emphasis really at the start of the lesson is on the pupils themselves, interpreting the story, noticing and perceiving situations where a particular virtue is either required or needed, or is perhaps actually demonstrated by one of the characters. And once the story has been shared, the grow section lesson involves a class discussion. And this is through questioning, which is guided by the teacher, whereby pupils are introduced to the language of the key virtue in focus. They're introduced to the meaning of that virtue term, so its definition, and they're also encouraged to discuss what's important, both for themselves in their own lives, but also how that character virtue can affect the lives of those around them in a positive and in a beneficial way. So it's really about drawing out the qualities of character from the story, and the focus during this questioning and discussion stage is on pupils' knowledge and understanding, and really deepening their familiarity with the language of virtue. And the discussion also provides the opportunity for reflection on the story, where pupils engage with the characters and begin to reflect on how they chose to act in certain situations. And it also provides the opportunity, crucially, for pupils to reflect on how they would act if they found themselves in a similar situation. And this is then followed by a pupil activity for each of the lessons, and this is to reinforce the virtue following the whole class discussion. And the pupil activities vary from paper-based tasks to play, group work, practical activities, but the aim of all of them is to further develop an understanding of the virtue, which has been explored initially through the story. And then finally, the go section of the lesson involves pupils being encouraged to try and apply the character virtue that they have discussed and that they've focused on using the story, to try and apply it back to their own life. So if the lesson was on honesty, if it was on teamwork, it's about encouraging pupils to think about how they can put that virtue into practice, both at home and in school, in their interactions with others and with their peers and teachers. So it's all about taking meaning from the story, reasoning about the right course of action, the right thing to do, and then relating it to real life situations. So this programme encompasses a range of pedagogical approaches to teaching character. So first and foremost, it's the use of stories, and stories which are challenging, stimulating and engaging. But through these stories then, virtue perception, knowledge and understanding are all developed. And this is through a teacher-guided discussion, using effective questioning, which also gives pupils that opportunity to reflect on the story and to try and relate it back to their own life. And one of the current research projects being run by the Jubilee Centre is a Pedagogy Project, which looks into what pedagogies work for teaching character. And so stories as a key vehicle through which character can be taught is being researched further at the moment. And just to mention, lastly, another programme, this time designed for upper key stage 2 for use in year 5 and 6, which is called Nightly Virtues. This also uses stories to teach about character. The stories are longer this time and more complex to be suitable for that age group. And all the resources are available on the Jubilee Centre's website, as is the case for Read, Grow, Go. So I'll hand back over to you, Aidan, for the Q&A session.
Thanks, Catherine. Thank you to all four of our speakers, to Beck, to Karen, to Paul and to Catherine, for four very different presentations on how and where character can be developed through the arts. If you would like to ask a question to any or all of our speakers today, please do post it in the chat. It's great to see not only our colleague Joe McDowell posting some helpful links to things on the Jubilee Centre website, but actually people connecting already, not just asking questions of the speakers, but connecting on areas of interest, which is fantastic. Gerald Jackson did ask a question which somebody has already responded to, but I'll ask this in a slightly different way to our speakers, maybe to Karen and to Beck, in terms of selection of stories, particularly ones that are relevant to maybe Black and ethnic minority groups, maybe to other students from different walks of life, and making sure that characters within those stories or art itself can be applied to somebody's life, and making it, because that's a real importance of character education, that it's relevant to our own lives. And of course, if we don't see characters represented in literature or in art that we can believe in and see ourselves in, then it feels a little bit futile. So maybe if I turn to Beck first and then to Karen.
Thanks, Aidan. So I think if there is a paucity of books featuring Black role models or Black children or Black lives in the library, you need to talk to the librarian, because there are a huge and rich and vast number of beautiful books to share. We've spent a lot of real deliberate time over the last couple of years making sure our curriculum fits and mirrors back this is the diversity and the cultures of our children. We have half an hour reading at the heart of every day, where we just read stories to the children. There's some analysis, but it's more for joy and pleasure and teaching reading for reading's sake. And we've got a real rich list. Year 7 are currently reading Boy Everywhere, which is about a refugee coming from Syria to Manchester. Year 8 are reading Noughts and Crosses. Year 9 are reading Jason Reynolds and The Hate You Give. So we make sure that there's consciously really positive role models, and also chance to look at moral dilemmas within the curriculum. We've also just changed our GCSE English curriculum because it was quite white, so that we've got more scope there. So I think it's just about schools and leadership recognising that as a priority, and then just doing something about it. There's lots of support there and lots of help about how to do that.
Thanks, Beck. Karen.
Yeah, I want to second everything Beck said. And I think a helpful question for any school or any teacher looking at the students, pupils we serve, comes from Alistair McIntyre. He says, we can't answer the question, how ought I live, until I can answer the question of what story or stories do I find myself a part. And so if we can really look at the rich stories and traditions and ethnicities of our school communities, we will find, and we make sure that our curriculum and all of the art, the music, the poetry, the narratives we include reflect back the giants and the unsung heroes of those stories and traditions. It's really important.
Thanks, Karen. There was another question there about the use of moral dilemmas or moral quandaries and how we incorporate those into teaching. So, a webinar about character through the arts. Maybe turn to Paul and to Catherine this time. With your primary teacher hats on, how might you go about addressing moral quandaries through the arts in your teaching? Paul.
Thanks, Aidan. It's a great question, I think. And this relates to one of the other comments that's been made. There is a risk of overanalyzing a story and kind of ruining its effect by delving too deep into it. But at the same time, when a character within a particular story, be it within Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2, or within secondary education, where there's a really key learning point that can be reflected on, I think just pausing, stopping and reflecting within that lesson or within that particular story at that relevant and timely point in the curriculum, I think it's worth doing. I don't think we need to overanalyze and use stories in that way all of the time. Every time a character faces a complex decision, we don't need to stop and pause and ask the children to reflect on it. But there might be certain events within longer or more complex stories that we could plan into our lesson delivery or into the curriculum as a whole. When it comes to reading for enjoyment, there might be certain parts of stories that we share with children that they maybe haven't engaged with themselves. They might not have read the story and be familiar with the characters, but we can share these with our classes, be it within literature lessons or be it with your whole class within the primary school. And I know that within Read, Grow, Go, there are virtues which are core to those lessons and not necessarily moral quandaries or dilemmas to focus on, but equally they can be focused on within specific stories that are based on those virtues.
Thanks, Paul. Catherine, would you like to add on that as well?
Yeah, it's a really brilliant question. And I think obviously this focuses on the arts, and we've sort of highlighted how stories can be used to help discuss different virtues, moral quandaries, and how to navigate those difficult situations. But I think it's worth bearing in mind as well that the arts work quite well with the humanities, and that you can spread this kind of focus on moral dilemmas across other subjects. So geography, history offer really exciting potential for, you know, looking back at key historical moments or current geo issues in terms of sustainability, and bringing all of that into the classroom so that it's very relevant and pupils feel that they've got a voice in terms of the big issues that are affecting the world at the moment and the dilemmas that are possibly facing politicians or people who are kind of in the public eye. And also, to go back to stories, it's brilliant. There's lots of opportunities for creative writing as well. So once a story has been shared and the pupils are fully involved with the messages, there's plenty of opportunities for reflecting on it within writing as well, and in kind of the creative part of the English curriculum, and also through role play and drama. So really creating a real theme around the book that's been chosen, and developing a kind of deep understanding about the right course of action that should be taken.
Thanks, Catherine. Just to move us on, there was a comment made by Ali Boddy at the University of Kent. Unfortunately, Ali just had to leave the webinar, but undertaking a research project looking at children's literature and charitable giving. Ali is easily found via the University of Kent website, but if anybody would like to look into that further, then please by all means get in touch with us and we can connect you with Ali. It's a comment, but I'll turn it into a question from John Lawson, which is the focus on STEM subjects is leading us to undervalue the teaching of the arts, which I would imagine a lot of us would agree with, and maybe bringing that even more to the present. We've seen the arts undervalued or devalued even more so during the COVID pandemic over the last year. How would our speakers address ensuring that the arts are, in educational terms, in schooling, continue to be appreciated? If I turn to Karen first in the US.
Sure. Just one observation. It's interesting that in Harvard Medical School, they have an arts and humanities initiative precisely bringing medical students preparing to become doctors to the museum and to the study of poetry, because they see these discussions as so powerful in developing human empathy and developing the kind of perception and insight that is important to their full responsibility as a doctor. It's also, there's tremendous opportunity for interdisciplinary work. We developed an art and science curriculum course that it was so powerful for the students. And again, it was a professor of anatomy and physiology who said, wow, this is such a powerful way to deepen your learning of the science, but have this greater awe and appreciation for the human body by focusing on art and nature and the environment, because and physics, all of these scientific subjects were being integrated with art. And you will find many scientists who love art and who need art and the humanities. So it's important that we just keep the conversation in our schools and in our universities open and lively about this theme, because otherwise we're forming lopsided professionals.
Thanks, Karen. Beck, is there anything you'd like to add in terms of what UOB School have been doing in the very, very present around making sure that character is developed through the arts, or the arts are emphasised?
I think it goes back to leadership, really, and if it's not a priority within leadership team, then it's very easy for it to slip. And so I guess we're quite lucky because character education is so pervasive. We look at exactly where it can be delivered. We're committed to STEM and the arts, and it is always a bit of a balancing act as to who has the time. But it is so important in developing rounded individuals that we just balance it. So art, music get as much time as physics and chemistry in Key Stage 3. I think as well, options choices in English schools can sometimes limit where those passions have to go at Key Stage 4, where sometimes you're only allowed to choose one art subject, and if you do triple science, you're not allowed to do art at all. So again, it's very important that schools that are committed to it enable that free choice at GCSE, and don't limit what children are doing there.
Thanks, Beck. We've got less than a minute because we will finish on time today. Just to offer one final comment before I thank our speakers and you for attending. There's a couple of comments here around encouraging staff who are reticent or not confident using art in the delivery of lessons. And as much as that comes through just kind of trial and error, and encouraging staff, as a couple of our speakers have said, in terms of having that strong leadership to encourage development of character through the arts in school. Also, it's okay to fail. It's encouraging that kind of, it's okay to do things that maybe don't work all that well first time, and ensuring that they kind of are reflected on and learnt from. I think one other point that I would make finally, we've talked a lot about maybe specific texts, and we've heard about particular texts or particular programs that work really well. There is no definite list of particular works of art, literature, plays, song lyrics, poems that contain very characterful references or that can be used to deliver character well. A lot of this is about an attitude and an approach to doing so, and actually I would argue that a lot of different art forms, if not all art forms, can help with a discussion around character and virtues. And it's much more about the way that we engage with those works of art. I would like to thank our speakers. I would like to thank Beck and Karen and Paul and Catherine for speaking today, and I would like to thank all of you for joining. I gather a couple of you might have had a little bit of a problem with the original link that was sent out, so I'm really glad that so many of you were able to join us this afternoon. We do have 3 more webinars lined up, the first of which is next week. They are moving on in terms of their topics as we cover the range of the Jubilee Centre's work, looking more at professional education and character in the professions. But if you are interested, please do check the Eventbrite page and the Jubilee Centre link. But I'm sorry we didn't get to all questions today, but thank you very much for joining us, and I do wish you a very pleasant Thursday afternoon or evening.